Everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar on sexual harassment in the workplace. I'm Caris Lambert, the Digital Content Manager here at Morpay. In this HR webinar, we'll share how you can ensure your workplace protects people from harassment and that your staff receive the dignity and respect at work. We'll also share how employers should appropriately manage the situation and ensure the right process is followed if a sexual harassment case is reported. So the topics we're covering today are what is sexual harassment and who is affected, why we need to talk about sexual harassment in the workplace, enforcement action from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, preventing harassment in your workplace, how to investigate and manage sexual harassment claims if they do occur, and understanding how bias and discrimination affects this whole process. And just a bit of housekeeping before we start. If you have a question as we go through the webinar, please pop it in the question panel you should see on your screen, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. If you're facing any technical issues, please put it in the question panel as well. If there's an influx, I'll just know there's something going on with the webinar and I can address it. But don't worry, we will send everyone a recording of this webinar when it's finished. So no need to take notes, we'll send you the slides as well. Yeah, just sit back and listen and have a cup of tea. So today, Audrey and Mick are combining their expertise to lead us through this topic. Audrey is our Senior Manager for Employment Law and joined Morpay in 2018. She has over 20 years experience in HR, employment law and legal services. Audrey is part of our HR services management team with particular responsibility for solicitor services, employment tribunal litigation and insurance. Nick, on the other hand, is our HR policy and consultancy manager who joined Morpay just a year after Audrey. He has over 14 years experience in employment law and HR advice, and Nick manages the HR policy and consultancy team to make sure our customers receive the right level of support on all their processes, policies and people initiatives. So you're in very good hands in this webinar as always. And I'll now be passing over to Audrey and Mick to start the main content of this webinar. So Audrey and Mick, if you could start this webinar. I can't hear you. I don't know if you're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I could hear you then. Your voice is breaking up a bit there.
Seem to be having a few problems here. Is that better, Caris?
Yes, I can hear the end of that sentence clearly, yeah.
Okay, if it causes any more problems, I'll try something different, but hopefully I'm coming over loud and clear now. I'm going to pass over to Mick to talk a little bit more about some of the definitions and so on. Sexual harassment covers a multitude of unwanted behaviours, from looks and touches, the dreaded workplace banter, pictures on the wall, pressure to spend time with people. So it's a very wide range of behaviours, and Mick's going to explain a little bit more about the background to the legislation around that.
Good morning, everybody. As Audrey said, it's important just to reflect on the legislative underpinning of what we mean by workplace sexual harassment and the obligations for employers. Now, for our purposes today, I think it's probably a little bit simplistic, but it's probably a good way of addressing this in three headings, if you like, really, as to what constitutes sexual harassment in the workplace. There's the first that we probably refer to as standard harassment, which is when someone is subjected to unwanted conduct, which is related to a relevant protected characteristic, in this case sex, which has the purpose or effect to, well, three words that we're going to return to throughout the webinar, of violating their dignity or creating an environment that is intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive. The second form of harassment is unwanted conduct of a sexual nature, which again has the same purpose or effect as we've described. The third is a bit of a nuance. It's when someone rejects or submits to unwanted conduct of the like that we've described with the first and the second forms. And because they have rejected or submitted to it, the harasser treats that person less favourably than they would treat them had they not rejected or submitted to that conduct. Now, in terms of thinking about what the unwanted conduct is and whether or not it did indeed have the purpose or effect as discussed, we need to consider the perception of the victim, the other circumstances of the case, and whether it is reasonable for the victim to have felt the conduct to have had that particular purpose or effect. It's not really enough for a victim to claim that unwanted conduct had that purpose or effect. It does importantly need to be reasonable and for it to have had that effect, taking into account all circumstances and their own perception. If we can move on to the next slide, please, Caris. Now, in terms of examples of sexual harassment in the workplace, now there's myriad examples, and this is complicated, and this is something that we're going to talk about in some detail by the use of perhaps social media accounts and what indeed actually amounts to the workplace. But on your screen there's a number of examples there of words or acts or other kinds of conduct, for example, invasion of personal space, comments, again, just drawing upon Audrey's example earlier of that dreaded word of banter in the workplace. It really is a very complicated picture and a very dangerous picture for employers in these examples. But it's important that we consider the purpose or effect of those words and acts that underpin that unwanted conduct. It doesn't matter in any circumstance that the alleged harasser didn't intend their conduct to have had the effect that the victim suggests it does. It's all about the purpose and the effect, regardless of what the intention is. Sexual harassment can also occur, or it can still occur rather, if the conduct isn't directly targeted at the victim. So again, obviously the use of or display of pornographic material in the workplace, the dreaded page 3 girl on the wall of a workplace is one example, or general sexualized comments in the workplace. It can take many forms, and that makes this whole risk to employers all the more murky and also vulnerable to wider behaviours outside of work.
So,
Sorry, Audrey, you went quiet there again.
as you see, sexual harassment in the workplace is really common. For a lot of reasons, it's very unreported or underreported. Outcomes are often unsatisfactory. So kind of putting aside the very real issues of justice and employers' responsibility to keep their employees safe, it's also it's a headache for employers. Dealing with this kind of unwanted behaviour for employees is a significant factor in them taking time out from work and for leaving. So it damages your workforce in terms of your people and their satisfaction. It's also damaging to an employer's brand, their desirability as an employer. There was a government survey in 2020, and the most frequently reported outcome for those who did report sexual harassment at work was that they left. So as we can see here, 45% of women have experienced sexual harassment at work. I mean, that's almost half, over a quarter of men. And 85% of women in this survey said their report was not taken seriously and dealt with appropriately. And I think we need to put this into the context that this doesn't paint the whole picture. Workplaces are just a part of wider society, and 97% of women in one survey and 75% of both genders reported that they'd suffered sexual harassment. We're talking about catcalls in the street, unwanted behaviour in social settings and so on. And this is the kind of overlap we're now getting, particularly through the advent of social media, between workplace and private life. And so it is really a very serious problem, and it's something employers really need to take very seriously. Mick, if you just, we were going to have a chat about this one, weren't we?
Yes, thank you, Audrey. Why it's such a serious workplace issue, just to continue some of the points there that Audrey's referenced, it can have long-lasting effects on those who experience sexual harassment in the workplace. I suppose by its very nature, complaints of sexual harassment is a very difficult thing for a victim to express and to communicate to their employer. Their very fear and shame associated with it can be compounded by the fact that of course their peers might not be affected by it in the same way. That those feelings of isolation can be exacerbated also in the absence of an active policy or procedure, engaged employees in that policy and procedure, and robust reporting and monitoring in the workplace. There was the CIPD research that you can see on your screen in referencing the kinds of issues that arise as a consequence of sexual harassment in the workplace, and why it's a serious issue. Perhaps so serious, and this is something that we'll come on to a little bit later in the webinar, is the fact that government has also responded to this with a response to a consultation exercise 1 or 2 years ago. Amongst other things, there were plans there to introduce more onerous legislative duties on employers, statutory codes, and strengthening enforcement action against errant employers who weren't respecting their duties and obligations under the Equalities Act. There's also the possibility of the reintroduction of explicit legal protections against third-party harassment as well, which could be a very serious concern for workplaces that are frequented by third parties, patrons at restaurants, bars, hotels, that kind of thing. So no, it is very serious, both for the complainant and also the employers seeking to address these concerns.
Yeah, if we can move on to the next slide, Caris. We did a little bit of research of our own here, speaking to young professionals who talked about their current roles, as well as their experience of working in hospitality. And they definitely felt there was a much higher profile through campaigns like Me Too and so on that empowered people to speak up. But they also acknowledged a perception that some people perhaps also complain about trivial issues. They actually reflected wider surveys that we've looked at elsewhere amongst all age groups, that people feel much more able to speak up to a perpetrator and defend themselves than they do about reporting issues. They echoed general findings that victims aren't believed, and that in particular some men, even if they're not in positions of authority, such as managers, are generally not challenged in social situations, but also quite a lot of sexual harassment in the workplace takes place between peers, and there'll be a sort of popular person that nobody feels comfortable to challenge. One particular issue they drew out about their experience of working in hospitality settings is that quite often the manager on the ground is likely to themselves perhaps to be relatively inexperienced, a sort of shift supervisor and so on, not very clear about how to deal with complaints. And what they all felt was that a clear process that everybody knows about, proper engagement at senior level, and just a transparent procedure about what happens next would make it much easier for people to complain, and also to equally, or perhaps more importantly, dissuade perpetrators. A lot of people worry that reporting it will cause them to have problems with their job. So it's not just a question of not being believed, but people have a variety of reasons why they think they could possibly suffer some detriment. And also they often think it's something they should just deal with themselves. Mick, back to you, I think, for the next slide.
Okay, so this slide is concerns enforcement action from the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. First and foremost, what on earth is that, you might say? The Equalities and Human Rights Commission is in effect Britain's equality regulator. And what it seeks to do is to enforce protections of the Equalities Act against errant employers. They have a range of enforcement powers at their disposal, amongst others, formal investigation, court action, and more commonly what we refer to as Section 23 agreements. Now I'll come on to an example of some high profile Section 23 agreements have been entered into, but just a little bit of context about their increasing involvement in this area. Ordinarily, you find yourself at the end of an employment tribunal claim citing sexual harassment, and that might be your experience of an employer when a complaint is raised, when internal procedures and so on have failed. But the Commission itself does seek to enforce the Act as well. The Commission is actually working closely with UK Hospitality, which is a leading industry body to tackle sexual harassment, with hospitality workers being of particular interest, given the perception that in those environments, those workplace environments where perhaps alcohol is being consumed, restaurants, hotels, pubs, and so on, there's the perception that workplace sexual harassment is something that's perhaps normal, or in fact considered part of the job. There's a lot of work in those areas to support those kind of employees. If we may move on to the other slide, Caris, and we have an example of quite a high profile business, I'm sure you'll agree, being subject to what's called the Section 23 agreement. Now, in brief, a Section 23 agreement is a legally binding pledge that the employer enters into with the Commission to, in effect, brush up where they're failing in terms of dealing with sexual harassment in their own workplace. McDonald's, of course, is a very multifaceted business. There's lots of angles to it, franchises and so on. But so it's probably advisable to consider this as just a large employer. But they, along with others, including Sainsbury's and Jaguar Land Rover, have found themselves at the end of a Section 23 agreement. Now, it's unclear how endemic the problem was at McDonald's, but there was action taken by a trade union acting on behalf of a number of affected workers, and by their record, they cite up to 1,000 separate complaints. Again, we need to take that with a slight pinch of salt, but it is probably quite a serious number of complaints that could be evidenced if it led to such a high profile commitment to making improvements internally. From the slide in front of you, you can see some of the key points that McDonald's pledged to work upon: enhancing policies and procedures to protect sexual harassment, conducting an anonymous survey of workers about workplace safety. That could be extremely useful to understand, well actually how bad is the problem internally, and what kind of things do we need to do to improve. Monitoring also is an important thing to understand. Well, are we actually getting to the bottom of this? Are we actually making appropriate improvements? Do employees feel confident enough to report allegations of sexual harassment, confident that they're actually going to be dealt with? So I'm sure it's interesting, as I'm sure you'd agree, that large employers can also find themselves in a bit of a pickle in terms of how they're actually dealing with sexual harassment and how their employees can be affected by it.
So preventing harassment in your workplace, clearly prevention is better than cure, and while nearly all employers are going to be disapproving of workplace sexual harassment, there's obviously quite a gulf between that general sense and really embedding a culture where the disapproval is core and behaviours change. Smaller private companies are in fact more likely to have instances of sexual harassment, and in the smaller companies people are also even less likely to report what's going on, and it's sometimes not as easy for small companies to drive cultural change. It's in some senses much easier for a large corporate business to impose that across their whole workforce. But it is really important to engage employees on the issue, raise awareness of your zero tolerance policy for unacceptable behaviour, and that's key to stopping it happening in the first place. So what you're aiming for really is a workplace environment that values difference, is free from hostility, based on tolerance, helps people to contribute more effectively, helps achieve higher levels of job satisfaction. Clearly, people are not working at their best if they're working in fear of harassment or bullying. And alongside that policy, it's important to promote the importance of respect between employees at every level of the organisation. And so it's not just about having policies, but about people living that, sort of flowing from the top and empowering people to speak up, not just when they themselves are victims of sexual harassment, but also more informal and casual challenges to each other. And change, of course, is perfectly possible. Smoking in pubs is an example of something that people thought maybe couldn't change and did. Seat belts in cars. When I was at school a very long time ago, we went on a trip to a local paper mill to see how paper was made. And the main thing I remember about that was all the pictures of naked women stuck all over the factory walls. And I'm fairly sure that wouldn't happen now. So it is possible to drive that change. And I think we absolutely should wherever we can do that. What's on to the next slide? 7 steps to preventing sexual harassment. As I've said, you need an effective policy and to engage your employees, but it's important to kind of look back a little bit and take steps, reflect on what steps you can take in your individual workplace. Step 4, just ensure that people know how to report, what the reporting will look like, and that even if they're not in the position of needing to report anything at that time, that's a really obvious step for them. Training managers in how to deal with complaints is important, but it's also important to train all of your workers to really consider their own behaviour and the behaviour of those around them. And whether that's done in formal sessions or more informally will depend to some extent on the resources of your organisation. But do make sure that anyone who is likely to be in receipt of a complaint isn't like a rabbit in the headlight, not really knowing what to do. And just also don't forget, as I think Mick mentioned earlier, harassment can come from third parties as well. It's not just between colleagues, but think about how it will be dealt with if it comes from customers or suppliers or service users or anybody else that you're dealing with. Karis, if we could move on to the next slide, how to investigate and manage sexual harassment claims. I think this is something everybody would like a simple answer to. What to do? How do I stay fair to all parties? How do I avoid all the risks and pitfalls? Mick, I think you're going to take us through this one.
Thank you, Audrey. Yeah, we've listed some key principles, if you like, really for dealing with a sexual harassment complaint. Now, of course, depending on your workplace, where the allegation has come from, who the allegation is against, that there are a lot of factors in play here, really, that could cause a great deal of issue for the person who's given the responsibility to deal with this. But perhaps one of the most important points, I think, is the first 2 here, really, which is the employer should listen and reflect upon the complaint that has been raised. The very nature of a complaint of sexual harassment is that it does come down to the perception of the victim, the wider circumstances of the case, and the wider context. Is it reasonable that this person has felt so aggrieved about the unwanted conduct they suggest they've been subject to? There is room, of course, for hypersensitivity and so on that the law does seek to guard against, but more often than not, there seems that there is something behind comments and a complaint, and it can be as little as people just genuinely not feeling that their behaviour is really that bad, and that obviously goes back to training, etc. But reflecting, does require the person dealing with this to consider matters objectively and to consider the victim front and centre of all of that. Being transparent and timely, the employer should act immediately to resolve the complaint, taking into account how the complainant wants it to be resolved. Being discreet, so respecting confidentiality both of the complainant and the accused, because naturally the accused might well be accused of this behaviour, but that doesn't mean to say that we're going to find evidence in support of it or that that's going to be our outcome. looking after people, protecting the complainant from ongoing harassment, and also moving the harasser to another team perhaps, or another site, or working virtually are examples of what we could do to do that. And also witnesses too. We do find with tribunal cases, for example, whereby witnesses do feel that they can't really speak up against actions that another have been accused of, that there can be that fear in a workplace of, oh gosh, well, I don't want to do anything really that's going to put a target on my head. Support any further action that the complainant might want to take. Harassment can also be a criminal offence as well, and employers should consider speaking to the complainant about any support that they might need in that area. Being very cautious about gagging orders. Now, suppose if I might put it this way, the pre-Me Too era, there was a practice here really through confidentiality clauses and non-disclosure agreements to basically get a complainant to keep quiet, protect the organisation from reputational damage, and that makes the matter go away. That is an increasingly risky tactic now, and it's something that we would always say, absolute, that legal advice needs to be taken if that is something that would ever be in contemplation. Don't unduly delay the outcome. Always communicate throughout an investigation with the complainant as to your progress, as to where your investigation is taking you, and also in terms of the outcome, try and deliver that in as timely a manner as we possibly can.
So we've popped a case study in here because it is quite a useful example of things that can go wrong. This particular case did become a tribunal claim. So I won't read it through, you can obviously see it on your screens, but the employee complained about inappropriate behaviour by her manager, and this was behaviour out of work. They were connected on social media, which is a typical way in which a private life and work life bleed into each other these days. It's mostly not possible to separate the two. Quite a lot of teams have their own WhatsApp chats, and they can be a source of difficulty sometimes. People follow each other on social media. So the company took this matter seriously, but the manager received, I suppose what you term a slap on the wrist, an informal outcome. This might not have been inappropriate. I'm not saying it was, but the employee then started to see anything that this manager did by way of directing her, such as mentioning things she should do differently, denying her holiday. She saw all that really through a prism of being revenge for the trouble she'd got him into for rejecting his advances. What had happened is very much at the sort of, for want of a better expression, mild end of the sexual harassment spectrum. But it was very difficult for the employer to manage because there were not clear records of the initial informal complaints. The outcome wasn't explained very well to her. He carried on managing her when potentially there could have been perhaps a different solution to that. And he was on the back foot of providing alternative explanations for some of the things that happened. So again, clarity as well as very clear record keeping, even of informal complaints, are really key. And I think that's something that would really have helped us all here. So how bias and discrimination can affect the process. We all have unconscious, sometimes conscious biases, and this can lead to inadvertent discrimination in dealing with sexual harassment in the workplace. So statistically, conventionally attractive people are more likely to be believed, perhaps a stereotype of a person that some people think is likely to be harassed. In fact, marginalized groups, people with disabilities, people with diverse gender and sexual identities, they're also more likely than the general population to suffer kind of the double whammy of harassment in the first place and then not being believed. And I think, we often make jokes about this type of thing. It's easy to make jokes about ourselves, for example. People joke about not being young anymore. I should be so lucky, grateful for this these days. And people make comments like that. In fact, young people are much more likely to be victims, of course, but young people are more frequently in junior roles and less likely to be believed. So that again is a bit of a double jeopardy for them there. Sexism, which kind of we're talking about popular misogyny really. I think a lot of people listening will be aware of the Andrew Tate case. He is a social influencer who spreads some very misogynistic ideas, such as rape victims being partly responsible for their own treatment. And that sort of thing is having a big effect, particularly people are concerned about its effect on teenage boys who are, of the age group where they're starting to enter the workforce as well. So it's really important that we think about the kind of attitudes that can lead to people having their concerns really dismissed. There was an example, wasn't there, Mick, recently of somebody famous who ran into a bit of trouble with sexual harassment in the workplace.
It goes into this final point about male employees and underreporting sexual harassment. I mean, there's this perception that the only people who can really be subject to sexual harassment are female, but of course it can be men as well. And perhaps against the grain of that particular part of the slide, in this example, there was the Irish actor Paul Mescal, who was, I understand, he was doing a play in London. Walks out the theatre to find a fan basically groping him on the backside when I think they were taking a selfie, and he protested, and it became quite widely reported in the news. Of course, the point was, well, why on earth would that be acceptable? How is it that he could be considered to be, public property for anybody attending the theatre? Now, of course, it may well be overextending things to say it was the workplace, but I think it's part of that kind of wider view in society that inevitably can bleed into the workplace through, people's attitudes, as Audrey suggested, the question of the influences like Andrew Tate and so on, where these attitudes kind of bleed into a workplace which is ever more wider and more looser than perhaps it was some years ago, is quite dangerous. So, are we making sure you're not bringing any biases on board? Now, this is quite an important slide, really, and it goes back to the entire approach, I suppose, that we take when considering sexual harassment. The importance of listening and reflecting to a victim of sexual harassment or somebody who's alleging that kind of behaviour. Do we bring with us any unconscious biases in looking to consider those words or those acts that they're relying upon as part of their complaint? Do any unconscious biases impact upon our ability to consider all the circumstances of the case and decide whether or not that individual could reasonably have suffered the purpose or effect that they suggest the unwanted conduct has had on them? We need to be very aware of bias, and everything needs to, of course, be considered in context. There are aspects here that we need to think about that are on your slide, any qualities of the claimant that might impact upon how they perceive things or how things look as far as they perceive them. Anything else that we need to consider, for example, personal relationships in the team, and looking to try and reduce any of the effects of biases in the workplace through robust frameworks, again, training, for example, as well, forcing employers and managers, people at all levels of the business, to think about, well, what is it that the victim is seeing? What is it that they're perceiving? How reasonable is that had the purpose or effect that was suggested? It's quite a hard exercise, but it's quite a necessary one.
Karis, have we got any questions come through?
Yes, we do. So thank you so much, Audrey and Mick. That was very informative. I hope everyone listening found it useful. So we've got a few questions come through. The first one is, how do you balance an investigation when it's kind of he said, she said situation? I'm guessing there's no witnesses in this case.
Yeah, and often, of course, that's where issues stem from. This type of thing is often not witnessed. So that's a very common scenario. That's why it's so important to have the clear processes and procedures in place. So people on both sides of a dispute need to have confidence in what will happen. Clearly, it's distressing to report. It's equally distressing to be accused, perhaps unfairly as well. So people need to be confident they're going to be treated properly. Also, it's important to remember this is not a court of law. You don't have to have unequivocal proof that an incident happened, but you just need to listen to both sides and really try and take on board in order to reach a finding about what you believe.
Great, thank you for that. And another question is, what should I do if, being honest, I think that a complaint is very trivial and it's something they could have dealt with themselves? That situation.
Okay, I'll take that one. So if we think that's something really trivial, was that, sorry, Cara, so that's something that they could have dealt with?
I suppose they mean that the claimant could have dealt with themselves.
Well, it's an interesting one, and again, it goes to, I suppose it's in the eye of the beholder in this example. I mean, that is the nature of all complaints of sexual harassment. Well, what an employer might deem to be really trivial might necessarily be the case, and it might actually be the case that that it is reasonable for them to have felt that it had that purpose or effect to make them feel violated, etc. It does go into the wider issues in society, I guess. What somebody might have experienced here might make them all the more vulnerable. You know, is their perception reasonable? I think all we can really do here is to conduct a reasonable investigation, review the evidence in a wider context. If the complainant is truly comfortable with an informal resolution, such as a managed conversation, that might be something that might be a good landing point for this. But it's always important to keep written records of these kind of things and conduct that full investigation. Again, what the person investigating might think is really trivial mightn't necessarily be the case once that exercise has been complete.
Thank you for that, Mick. That really helped. And I'm just going to have one more question for time reasons. And this is a particular case. So someone says they had a case where someone got a warning, but it was very awkward. It resulted in an awkward situation. And in the end, the woman who had raised a complaint just left the company. What would you advise this company should have done in that situation?
Well, I think it's really important to make sure that somebody who makes a complaint of sexual harassment doesn't suffer any detriment. And by detriment, that's not just from the company itself, but also retaliation potentially from the person who's been accused. You may have to look at moving someone, and almost certainly that should be the person who's been accused. It would only really be with the express agreement, if not suggestion, of the complainant that you would move them. Maybe look at lines of reporting very carefully, whether you can offer the complainant any support with a mentor or so on. It's really difficult to give ideas when you don't know much about the organisation, but again, training may prevent that from happening again. Training gives people a framework, a vocabulary to empower them to tackle behaviour they don't like. And it also helps people to understand their own behaviours a little bit better. As I say, it's a bit difficult to know without knowing a bit more about the context, but that would be the general response.
Great, that was very helpful. Thank you, Audrey. So just a reminder that we'll be sending these slides afterwards, as well as a recording of the webinar, if anyone wants them. If you do want more advice just on general HR processes as well as payroll, just go to the Knowledge Centre on our website. We've got loads and loads of advice, best practice legislation, from blog articles to guides to white papers. And we also have a webinar every month. So if you'd like to join the next HR one on managing the redundancy process, just leave your email, the survey that pops up after this, and we can sign you up. But if you do want some more bespoke one-to-one support and guidance on preventing and managing sexual harassment claims in your workplace. Do stay on the line, as Stuart Atkinson, our Commercial Business Development Manager, is just going to run you through some ways that MorePay could support you if this is something you're wanting to look at in your organisation. So over to you, Stuart.
Thank you. Thanks, Caris. Good morning, everybody. As she said, my name's Stuart Atkinson. I'm Business Development Manager. And I mean, that's a great webinar with some great information in there. So to take it on the next level up of how can MorePay help you with that and support you around that. I mean, MorePay has been around since 1966. So we're close to 6 decades of dealing with this type of stuff and everything around that. We build our systems on a quite secure platform, the Microsoft Azure platform. You might be familiar with it, you might not be. But we have in-house at MorePay dozens of qualified HR subject matter experts, everybody with a unique skill set. There's not really anything that we can't tackle at MorePay. And if you take some time to have a look at our accreditations at the bottom of the screen and also our Trustpilot rating, you will see that what we deliver and what we support is second to none. Can you slide up for me, please? So how do we do this? How do we tackle this and make it as easy as we possibly can? We use the method through intuitive, simple software. We deliver quality services on each aspect of what MorePay does. This means that your business can save a lot of admin, a lot of time, effectively leaning on MorePay when it comes to supporting your own processes, making sure you're compliant, keeping up with legislation, which is, I think we're at the end of March and there's been a lot of legislation this year already. It's coming thick and fast, so there's no sign of that letting up, but you can ease the burden of that. And staffing problems are an issue for everybody at the moment. If that is an issue, we can plug a gap there as well. It's worth a conversation around that. Can you click the next slide, please, Caris? If you have a look at our Trustpilot reviews, we've snapshot a few on there, but by all means log on to Trustpilot and have a look for yourself. It speaks for itself. There is endless amounts of 5-star reviews, and Audrey, Mick and the team in the office, the service they deliver really is top level. It is top of the Premier League. It's worth actually just having a chat and seeing where we can fit in there. Even if it's not on the topic today, there's other things in there we can help you with. So there's quite a few packages in there. You can see the packages on the screen, and a lot of it's aimed at reducing and managing sexual harassment cases. If you have any live ones or you have anything historic that went bad or anything, by all means, get in touch. We'll set up a meeting. We can have a chat about that and discuss maybe the way it went down or the way to handle a current live one. The diversity, equity and inclusion policy review that we have is an off-the-shelf solution. So we can just deliver that and bring it in the organization, or we can build on that. We can review your policies. We can focus on the sexual harassment and recommendations. We can give you processes, procedures, and shore up how you do that now. If you have any concerns that what you have in place isn't right, by all means, this is where you need to go, and this is how we're going to look at that and review it and bring it up to date. There is a diversity, equity and inclusion policy training that we have as well, which has you can bring in a number of delegates, a number of line managers and so forth. That's a very nice product. It's very good as well, because as we know, the front line is the line manager, and making sure it's handled in the first instance, as was alluded to on the webinar, is key. And a lot of times personal opinions and unconscious bias tends to make things a lot worse, and more so than a lot better. We can also deliver bespoke support. So if your organization needs something tailored, specific, for example, if you needed specific subject sexual harassment training for managers or key personnel, that's deliverable. There can be a bespoke written to suit your organization and your needs, because different organizations, if you have people out on the streets dealing with whatever it be, or people in-house or dealing with a certain member of a customer base that would be quite rowdy and so forth like that, we can look at that and deliver something bespoke and create that with you hand in hand to make sure it's exactly what it is and nail the risks down in there. We do a lot of train the trainer, so we can train someone in your organization who can then feed that training down and into that. That's not a problem. But there's lots of packages in there. There's lots of options that we can consider. And if you would like to speak to any of them, I'll be the person you speak to. Please reach out and we will set up a meeting and we can have a little chat around that. Okay, thanks for your time today, guys. I'll hand you back to Karis.
Thank you so much, Stuart. That was really good to hear about. Yeah, so just to reiterate what Stuart said, if you are interested in any of these products, then please, you can either reach out to Stuart or you can pop a question in the question box and just let us know what you're interested in, and we'll arrange just a very informal follow-up call with you to see if we can help you. So that's the end of the webinar. I will send out this webinar recording and slides tomorrow, so just keep an eye out on your emails and that'll come through. Thank you everyone so much for coming. Of course, thank you to Audrey, Mick and Stuart, and we will see you on the next one.